applied for the most part was the terra nullius argument.
That terra nullius just was not a correct legal doctrine, and for a fact, the United Nations has denounced that terra nullius as not a legal doctrine that entitled people to come and take other people's land.
By the turn of the 18th century, already there were 400 farms in possession of settler farmers. Some of these farms, 10, 20 of them even, owned by one person or in the name of one person.
Within 50 years of the arrival of Jan van Riebeck, the Khoisan tribal life and economy, based on livestock and land, disintegrated. For many years, historians attributed this to the smallpox epidemic. Today, modern interpretations of the old historic records have changed the narrative.
So you have in the beginning, you have reports that there are anything between 150,000 and 200,000 Khoi people in the Cape. You also have reports from the Europeans that they had tens of thousands of herds of cattle, 20 of thousands of herds of sheep. So you had a rich people with a sustainable livelihood who had the land and who had the water, and they were probably one of the most successful farming communities in Africa, not just in South Africa. Through colonialism, literally within 50 years, the backbone of this entire economy is suddenly eroded. Now, what we are told by the colonial history books is that there was the smallpox epidemic in 1713 and that everybody got wiped out. Now, that's just absolutely not true.
The reports were very much of actual theft and robbery and murder, and some colonists even went as far as what we would now regard as being the Eastern Cape. And they basically attacked Khoi groups and stole their cattle and massacred.
It was indeed not a free exchange of commodities. And part of that trade was accompanied by violence.
Once the colonists began to expand further into the interior and their farms became more widespread, and they needed to defend and protect the cattle that they'd stolen or bartered from the Khoi, you needed a force to protect the colonists.
Dutch used a system that we now know, known as the commando system, in order to coerce Khoi people who were still trying to hold on to land in their independent tribal forms to get rid of that land or to transfer that land to Dutch, into Dutch ownership.
It had tragic consequences for us and our forebears, as well as the present generation in South Africa. That peace treaty of the Cape of Good Hope demonstrated Dutch might in the Cape, that finally they lost not only their land, but also the independence.
The Dutch East India Company commander Jan van Riebeck first heard from his Khoisan translator Krotoa about the cattle-rich and powerful tribe that lived just over the mountain. The company was under pressure to find more meat and were looking for other tribes to trade with. In the company journal, it is written, "A much bigger nation with a greater wealth of stock." Like the rest of the Khoisan tribes, the Hasakwas were transhuman and there were no real boundaries. Roughly, they grazed their herds all along the Sonderend River and in Swellendam, all along the Breda River and as far east as the Gourits River. They had a good relationship with their neighbors, the Gourikwas on the east side and the Hainukwas on the western border, and the groups often strayed into each other's territory.
early accounts by travelers and traders were often fragmentary and sometimes even inaccurate. But we do find evidence of the presence of the Khoisan in the names of rivers and places. This is the Hesquas River, and behind me is the Hesquas Kloof. The Hesquas lived in this region, some 2 kilometers west of Swellendam. This is Mossel Bay Beach on the South Cape coast. It is Khoisan territory, not Hessequa, but we start our journey on the Hessequa here because of its historical significance. To answer some of my questions, I'm going to meet with Professor Michael de Jong, who has done extensive research on the Hessequa and written this book, A Forgotten First People, the Southern Cape Hessequa. Professor de Jong, before we start speaking about the Hessequa, can you tell me a little bit about the first contact between the Khoisan and the Europeans that apparently happened in this area?
Yes, this was a particularly significant contact because Bartholomew Diaz came to the shore and stepped ashore, and he saw people here with cattle who had been grazing just above us here, and they entertained him and welcomed him in a very friendly manner. This was in 1488. Because the Gourits River is so close to here, we deduce that they were the Khoisan. Now, Khoisan or Khoisan actually means people of the cattle. And they did have cattle. In fact, the early Dutch people called this Gourits River, which is close to us, the Rio dos Vaqueiros, which means the river of the cattle people.
And people speak about a skirmish here. Was that skirmish between the Khoisan and the Portuguese?
When Diaz landed here, it was a friendly meeting. In fact, they danced and sang a song and said, welcome to us. And they had good relations. But upon returning at a later stage, they came back to this particular spot because there's a spring up here looking for fresh water. And there was a misunderstanding. And in fact, there was a skirmish. And these sailors had to go back to the little sailing ship very quickly. I think these people who arrived here presumed they can take water, they can help themselves to cattle. I think that might have been the origin, because there's a particular custom in terms of how strangers approach people like the Khoisan, and I don't think they were aware of that.
According to the ship's records, Diaz shot and killed one of the Khoisan with his crossbow.
Diaz became the first murderer of a herder at that time. That was when Bartholomew Diaz arrived at Mossel Bay.
The cattle post at Rietvallei, just outside Swellendam, became an important trading stop. At first, the Hessequa were willing traders. The trade link enabled the Cape governor to supply passing ships with meat on a regular basis. Klaas Dorre's name first appears in VOC records when he introduced the Dutch to the Hessequas for trade. Klaas was a Hainukwa captain, and after the death of Suswa, the respected chief of the Hainukwas, Klaas became one of the leaders. His kraal was here, not far from Grabo, and for 20 years he was the important middleman in their trade with the Hessequas. In 1693, things changed, and the governor Simon van der Stel suspected Klaas Dorre of working against them. They attacked his kraal, arrested him, and confiscated all his livestock.
Klaas, or Captain Dorre, was a man who tried his hardest, I suppose, to cooperate or collaborate with the company. The futility of trying to form alliances with the company, that eventually the company turned on him, stripped him of his wealth, stripped him of his power, and he finished his life in poverty.
Although the company leadership, the Here 17, condemned Governor van der Stel's actions, the damage had been done.
His life is an illustration of, I suppose, that one of the options available to the Khoi was collaboration rather than resistance, and his life story really shows the futility of collaboration.
But later, trading expeditions by settlers often deteriorated into cattle raids. One of the most callous attacks happened in the Eastern Cape.
They did horrific things to the Khoi and San clans, owners of livestock, to the extent that Simon van der Stel put a ban on the trade in livestock between the Khoi and the Freeburgers.
This area was called Bakleiplatz, or site of fighting, because of skirmishes between the Dutch and the Khoisan. By 1769, the once wealthy Hesequas that traded with the Dutch here possessed hardly any livestock.
The Landtrust of Stellenbosch reports that the Khoi society is already in disarray and disintegrating in the southwestern Cape before even the smallpox epidemic, and he attributes this largely to incursions by violent colonists. He mentions one character in particular he calls Dronke Gerrit, and I think the name says it all. Dronke Gerrit was a man who turned to violence to basically rob the Khoi of their livestock, and one can imagine that he wasn't alone. He probably had huntlangers, and they had muskets, and were a pretty formidable force.
There was a huge increase in the demand for meat and produce. So they had to also acquire large amounts of cattle from the last remaining independent Khoi tribes. The commando system was used effectively to coerce these tribes to trade with the Dutch.
Once the Khoi lost their cattle, they had very few options except to either become laborers for the new class of company settler, who was finding it was much easier to be a cattle farmer or a sheep farmer than it was to be an agriculturalist.
The few remaining Hesequah kraals were under constant threat from land-hungry farmers moving in from the Cape. Professor Russell Viljoen did extensive research into a case of land dispossession in 1787. A farmer named Johannes Nicholas Swart displaced a whole community of Khoi under Captain David Valentine close to Rivier Sonnerend.